Welcome everybody to Understanding ACEs. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. We're glad to see everybody. Our presenters today are going to be Alan Rasmussen from Rappahannock Rapidan Community Services, Prevention Manager there, and Kaitlyn Nickson, who is also a clinician with Rappahannock Rapidan Community Services. And they are pros on this topic, and we are so glad to have them with us today. Welcome, Kaitlyn and Alan. And then Renee Norden is going to be also a facilitator. She's going to lead us in the discussion afterwards.
Bridget, I appreciate that introduction, and I know Kaitlyn does too. And I know we're excited to be here with everyone today and, you know, the people in attendance, but I also want to express our gratitude. Renee's always talking about give thanks and gratitude and stuff, but one of the things I give gratitude for big time is to be in partnership with the Mental Health Association and to make this training series happen for the community. And it just feels so good when people show up, we interact, and we do some of this vital training. So I want to give thanks for that relationship and for being here today. And I also want to give thanks for being with Kaitlyn. And so as we open up here, I'm Alan Rasmussen, Prevention Manager for RRCS.
And I'm Kaitlyn Nickson. I work in our substance use services at our outpatient clinics at RRCS.
I'd like to note that Kaitlyn and I used to work together in prevention, and she moved into clinical services. So we had a great working relationship. We were trained together in ACEs and other programs. So it's great to be back here doing this training with you today, Kaitlyn. And I would like to say that as prevention manager for RRCS prevention, the focus of our work in prevention is on substance abuse and suicide prevention. And so, you know, we believe that these community issues need community solutions. So it's critical to work together with community partners and community members to make a difference in the lives of others. You know, this prevention philosophy it's not one person or one group doing it all. It's involving everyone and making things happen together, making differences together. So I would like to note that Kaitlyn and I were trained as master trainers in adverse childhood experiences on February 12, 2019. Time's moving along there, Kaitlyn. So, and you know what? I'm proud to say that Kaitlyn and I were trained by Dr. Robert Anda, who is the originator, one of the originators of the ACEs program. Now, how cool is that? You know, the guy that helped develop it, he was there. He came to Richmond. We were there. We were trained by him. So we got to interact with him and ask key questions and get it straight from the guy who developed this program. I mean, that gives me, sorry to say, I get excited about that because it feels pretty neat. But his scientific work and studies are at the root of what we will be talking about with you today. This is an evidence-based program, and we will need to do the program just like we were taught by Dr. Anda. You know, so I always tell a short story. You know, I don't want to overdo the thing, but one time we were on break and I got with Robert Anda and Dr. Anda, and I said, look, I'm listening to you and the program here, and I'm thinking when we go back to our community, you know, we're going to show these slides. We're going to share the information that you put together for each slide. And that's how we're going to do the presentation to protect its integrity and reliability. And he said that's exactly right. He had shared that he had written every word that we're going to say today for this presentation. You know, as it pertains to the slides and everything, he put it together exactly like he wanted it said. So you're going to get it straight from Dr. Anda through us. And so I do want to say this, that ACEs training is about trauma and toxic stress and its connection to a variety of health and social problems in our communities. And these are issues that RRCS prevention and other community partner organizations work to address. So this information is critical. ACEs actually account for a large percentage of health and social problems in the United States. So you know what? Let me give you some examples of ACEs as we get started here. Some adverse childhood experiences can include abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual, bullying, violence of or by another child, sibling, or adult, homelessness, and I'm seeing more of that in the news, I can tell you now, but in our communities. But household ACEs can be substance abuse, mental illness, domestic violence, incarceration, parental abandonment, divorce, or other loss. It can be involvement in the child welfare system. That's an ACE. Medical trauma, natural disasters, and war. I mean, look what we have going on now, the impact in the news with this war going on with Russia and Ukraine. Natural disaster, neglect, again, emotional and physical neglect, racism, sexism, or any other form of discrimination. And again, general violence in our communities, and that's big time in the news. So keep in mind that toxic stress can change the genetic makeup of individuals, causing the impact of this toxic stress to be passed on from one generation to the next. I mean, I want you to process that in a minute, because this makes this generational. It gets into our genes. As a community, we have to work to stop the generational impact of ACEs and help those impacted by this type of trauma. So, to us, ACEs is a movement. If we use the information provided today and the work we do with individuals who have been affected, we can make a difference in the lives of others, as well as in our communities for years to come. Kaitlyn and I are excited to be with you and look forward to using the information provided today together as we work to save lives and make a difference in our communities. So we're gonna start this official training now. What's cool about this, as you'll hear me, you've heard enough from me right now, but I'm gonna talk a little more, and then you'll get a break from me and you'll get to hear Kaitlyn. And then, you'll never get tired of her, but she'll turn it back over to me. We'll go back and forth. And then Renee has got some key information to provide at the end. So I'm going to start the program now. So what if the largest public health discovery of our time is about the smallest of us? Today, we are talking about a surprising and powerful scientific discovery. From that first spark of life, as cells divide and form a tiny beating heart, a fragile skeletal structure, a central nervous system, the experience of being in relationship with another person and with the world around us has profound impacts on who we are and who we will become. Although we can recall and describe with words much of what has happened in our lives, the memory of human experience is stored in our bodies and not just in our minds. This presentation today is about discovery. It's a story of scientists who challenged themselves to think differently about the facts they could see. This is a story of their impatience with the amount of heart disease, diabetes, depression, and suffering that exists in our country. It's a story about the courage to set aside beliefs that can hide the truth, and about systematically testing new possibilities. And finally, this is a story about you and me and what we might do with a scientific discovery powerful enough to profoundly change the future of the public's health. We are going to share with you findings from the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. We'll call it the ACE study. The ACE study confirms with scientific evidence that adversity early in life increases physical, mental, and behavioral problems later in life. The ACE study is the largest study of its kind, with over 17,000 participants. It was developed and co-sponsored by Kaiser Permanente of San Diego, California, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. This was done in the early 1990s. Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Rob Anda are the co-principal investigators of the ACE study. Dr. Anda, who designed the ACE study while he was working as a senior scientist at the CDC, reviewed and approved all of the information from the study that we will report to you today. So Kaitlyn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure, thank you, Alan. So before we run through kind of what the ACE study was, how it was conducted, I know it's early, it's only, 10 a.m. or so, but I'm going to give you guys a little rundown of a quick anatomy lesson, so to speak. So if you got your coffee, maybe break it out right now. So, but again, before we introduce the ACEs study, I do want to explain a little bit specifically about our brain development. So the human central nervous system connects us to not only ourselves, but also to other people and our environment and the world around us. The central nervous system consists of our brain, our spinal cord, and those two integrate all of our senses and information from the receptors located throughout the entire body. So it integrates internal body functions and it manages elaborate chemical and electrical signaling and all of that. And the central nervous system determines our understanding of and also our response to the world that we live in, which is really kind of what I'm going to be driving home in this section with you guys today, is really how we respond to our environments and why we do it in the way that we do it. So our neurons are stunningly effective really at processing and transmitting the information, and they have that central purpose in doing so. And that is to adapt in ways that keep us as human beings alive, right? So that adaptation is really important, and that's kind of what we're going to break into in the next couple of slides. So if you guys kind of look at this slide right here, what we're looking at is synaptic density. So on the far left over here, we see a set of brain cells, or what I'll call neurons, and what they might look like at the time of birth, right? So there aren't many connections between these cells at birth because as babies, we don't really need as many connections. So most of the wiring of our brains occurs as a result of life experience from our senses, which is why at birth, we don't really have as many of those connections because we don't have as many experiences. So by age 6, or kind of what we're calling in the middle here, that elementary age, you see on your slide in the middle, by age 6, those same brain cells now have many, many connections. The wiring of the brain, or the making of these complex neural networks, is totally experience dependent. What gets experienced the most tends to lead to more robust connections between these nerve cells that forms these neural networks. And so, right, if you guys kind of try and think back, elementary school, we're being bombarded with information all day, every day, which is why we have so many of these connections, right? But if you guys take a look at the right side of your screen here, over here, we're looking at what looks like a little bit less neural connections, right? So the last section represents about the time of puberty, or for most folks, we consider that about, age 12, 13. And there are now fewer connections between these brain cells. And this is because the least experienced connections tend to withdraw at about the time of puberty. And this, we call this process pruning. And this phenomenon helps us to understand why neglect, such as, not getting experiences that we need, can have such a powerful negative impact on our health and well-being and our social functioning. So when there's little activity, that synaptic connection will literally dissolve. That's why we're seeing kind of that pruning process over there in the puberty time, or again, that age of like 12 to 13, right? So as I said, in elementary school, we're getting bombarded with information and we don't consistently use all that information, right? I'm sure everybody on this call right now remembers that we probably learned some things in elementary school that we don't remember now, right? Because it's experience dependent and that consistency is key to form those strong neural networks. And so it's kind of that use it or lose it process is a way to think about that. And so as we're looking at here, right, every person's life is unique, but for the sake of ease and illustration, we'll imagine two worlds over the next couple of slides. So one is mean and dangerous, which is kind of that top path that we see up there. And the second is kind and generous. So traumatic experience during development, like abuse, neglect, chaotic relationships, those generate predictable patterns of not just behavior and traits, but actually physical brain structure and architecture. So humans are really only made to be under stress for about 20 minutes at a time. And usually when I say that, I get a couple like weird stares because a lot of us tend to feel stressed. But when we're talking about like that 20 minutes, what Alan and I are talking about is this toxic stress that comes from ACEs. And we'll touch on that a lot more throughout the rest of the training here today. But this is long enough to prepare for a fight or to hide, right? It's that fight or flight response that kicks in. So experiences that cause stress chemicals to be continuously produced, for example, going back to something like child abuse or neglect, or even being in a war zone, as Alan was talking about at the opening of our presentation this morning, have a huge impact on our development as people. So under these circumstances, our bodies tend to be prepared for a life in a dangerous world, right? Kind of that top path. We tend to be a bit more hypervigilant, and our stress levels at a baseline are a bit higher. So for example, people who have had traumatic stress from conception to the toddler years, again, will have that higher baseline of stress hormones like cortisol in their bodies at all times. And as a result, these folks might have a very short fuse. They might be a little bit more self-focused, and they might have a really difficult time shifting from emotion to a more logical or problem-solving approach. The downside to stress hormones like cortisol hanging around for a really long time is that they are literally toxic to brain cells. So if you guys remember the previous slide, right, when we see that dissolving of those neural networks, right, that's what we're talking about. It's toxic to those brain cells and those connections. So it makes it difficult for brain cells to develop those healthy networks and will even cause some of those brain cells to die off. And that's why we call continuous stress or trauma and episodic unpredictable stress. That's why we call it toxic stress, which is how Alan and I are going to refer to it for the rest of the training here this morning. So the lower path of this diagram, or what we call like the benevolent world, the more generous or nice, caring world, people growing up on this path are more likely to develop a brain with cells and wiring and chemistry for being more focused, flexible, and these folks also tend to be a bit more relationship oriented with others as well. So usually when we do this presentation in person, I'll kind of turn this over to our audience and ask the question, you know, what kind of situations might be good or a good match for a person who tends to be edgy or hypervigilant, emotionally detached, or quick to act, you know, maybe folks that took that top path in life who might have those ACEs. But our picture here kind of gives it away, right? It's our first responders. We tend to see a lot of our folks in first responders having the adaptations that make the job not easier, but more manageable for them, right? Which sounds a little strange, but we'll get into it. So a common belief in our society is that people whose experiences take them along that top path are maladaptive, and the people along the bottom path are adaptive. However, Alan and I don't like those words, right? So ideally, no matter what your situation was, maladaptive isn't really the right language because we're all adapting to whatever experiences that we have, right? It's not maladaptive, it's I'm learning how to handle a situation that largely is often outside of our control, right? We're not typically responsible for the hand that we're dealt in life, so to speak. But it is our responsibility to figure out how to play that hand in the best way that we know how. And that's exactly what we're talking about with adaptation. So both of those pathways are adaptive, both brains are adapting to the experience that they are put into. And it's good for us as a species that we can do that, right? So the people whose brains adapt to that dangerous or stressful world are more likely to survive when life is difficult or in stressful situations. Their fight or flight response tends to be a bit more honed, if you will, than folks that have taken along the bottom path, which is why we tend to see so many of these folks in our first responders. So the people whose brains are wired for a safe world are likely to be more prepared to meet society's expectations in more tranquil times. And those experiences really do get wired into our biology, which hopefully is one of the big takeaways that you guys take from this presentation, because it's something that we're going to dive into quite a bit. And so adaptation versus expectations, right? Sometimes our adaptations don't meet what society expects from us, which is how this becomes really difficult. So it's when our biology kind of collides with the social expectations that we run into some trouble, right? So if we put a person from the benevolent world into the chaotic and turbulent environment of like riot control, for example, that person might really, really struggle and have a difficult time unless they have learned and practiced some very specific skills. It takes a long time to hone those skills. And so likewise, a child adapted to a more dangerous, stressful world, or again, that top path from our previous slide, they might struggle to be able to sustain patience. So they may not share, they may not cooperate or use words as their first choice. And when that child comes to school, I don't know who all we have on the call right here, but one of the best examples of this is seeing this play out in the classroom, right? So when the child comes to school and we ask them to sit still, share, and cooperate for 8 hours straight, right? There's a painful disconnect there that is hard for not just the teacher and the other students, but that child as well, right? They're really struggling to meet those social expectations that really weren't built for the environment that they have adapted to. So one of the factors that determines the effects of maltreatment is age, right? A lot of people on this call have probably heard of like critical periods for development, sensitive periods. There's a bunch of different terms for it. But why would the age of a person at the time of maltreatment have a powerful effect? And it's because the brain develops in sequence from the most primitive to the most advanced. So that age is very important because we develop in stages, essentially. If you guys remember back, the time at birth, right? Those neural networks, there weren't really a lot because as a baby, you don't need a lot, right? We're talking about the most primitive to the most advanced when we're in adulthood and that whole time span in between. So as the brain develops, there are sensitive periods for each brain region when the size and the functional abilities of that region are most affected by experience, and they're most vulnerable to that toxic stress that Alan and I have been talking about so far. So new abilities build on growth and development from earlier months and years. And over time, our elaborate systems of specialized brain regions develop that help us to navigate our increasingly complex environments, right? So as a baby, we don't need as many. And as we grow, we're learning to navigate much more complex situations, environments, and relationships. So toxic stress in early childhood has profound effects on, again, not just the function of the brain, but the physical architecture and structure of the brain that develop later in childhood. So these functions include things like mediation of emotional responses, social interaction, and abstract thinking as we continue to grow and get older. But early childhood isn't really the only sensitive developmental period according to our most latest research. So each brain region has sensitive periods when experience has powerful effects on brain mass and functioning. I'll give you guys an example. So during middle childhood, which we say is usually about 7 to 13, emotional and verbal abuse affects the centers for processing sound, developing verbal language, and perceiving social cues for both boys and girls. However, there are differences between the two sexes. For example, both neglect and sexual abuse affect boys and girls, right? Regardless of the sex, that's going to have a powerful effect on development. But neglect in infancy and through the toddler years for boys has a large effect on that cross-brain communication, while that cross-brain communication is mostly affected in girls when they experience sexual abuse from ages 7 to 10. So the same brain region is affected, but different types of ACEs affect the sexes differently. So by the time we reach our mid to late 20s, our central nervous system, which orchestrates everything, like I said, from automatic body functions like breathing and heartbeat to more complex goal-oriented behavior and abstract analytical thinking, that starts to, come together a little bit is a good way to put that. It starts to kind of come together. And it's important to understand and be able to identify stress and what that toxic stress looks like. So stress can be interpreted as the brain, depending on which kind of path you took in life, either as something we can tolerate, right, and work through. We see it as manageable, perhaps, if we took that bottom path in life, that kind of safe, benevolent world, so to speak. A lot of us that took that path might see stress as something that might be frustrating, but is manageable. A lot of us that took that top path in life might see stress as overwhelming and unmanageable and too much, right? So our set points for these interpretations are largely in place by adulthood, right? However, just because these set points are largely in place by adulthood does not mean that we cannot build the skills necessary to be resilient, which is, again, another takeaway that I want you guys to pull from this. We're going to be talking about a lot of difficult subjects and topics in here today, but resilience is possible. And towards the end of the presentation, we're going to be talking about more resilience and pointing you guys towards resources if you need those. So we do have a choice though, right? So we've talked about the sensitive developmental periods. I kind of threw a lot of information at you guys and talked about how that toxic stress has profound effects on human development. But these childhood times are also windows of opportunity, right? Like I was talking about, resilience, positivity, a strengths-based focus. So we can either pay attention to the sensitive developmental periods, and we can do a better job protecting our children and providing the kinds of challenges and supports that they may remediate earlier periods of toxic stress and promote lifelong health and well-being. We can either, to put it simply, develop the skills and accommodations necessary that enable everybody to contribute to our community, or we can continue doing what we've historically done and continue that societal pattern of rejecting people when they have normal adaptive responses to childhood adversity. I'll give you another example, right? Going back to the classroom. Everybody in this room has probably had some experience, I assume, of whether you were the child that was acting up in the classroom or you knew the child that was acting up in the classroom. And historically, what have we done? Sent them to the principal's office, sent them out of the classroom, push them away, punish them, right? But we don't ask why the behavior is happening. We don't ask where some of this stuff is coming from, right? And so we can change these things just by opening up a little bit of a dialogue here and asking, what's happening at home? Start that communication. That communication is really important. So if you guys remember only one thing from this information about brain development, and I admit it was a lot and it's early, I hope that it will be that toxic stress becomes hardwired into our biology. It does not just affect our personality and our functioning, it affects the actual structure of the brain. And before we assume a person's rebellious behaviors are, a choice, so to speak, let's just think about the possibility that adversity might be kind of at the heart of the challenges and some of the behaviors that we might be seeing. So with that, like I said, if you guys have questions, we'll definitely have time at the end to maybe answer some questions. I know that was a lot of information, but make sure to write those down, save them, put them in the chat if you want to, whatever works, and we'll definitely get to them. But as for now, you guys are done hearing me speak for a little bit. I'll turn it over to Alan, and he's actually going to take us through how the actual ACE study was conducted.
Kaitlyn, I gotta say, I always listen to you do that, and I'm always amazed. You do a beautiful job. Thank you for your delivery this morning. So, okay, we have been talking about the effects of toxic stress on individuals. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the effects of toxic stress on the population as a whole. The field of epidemiology is where we will turn. Epidemiologists are scientists who study the origins of disease, disability, productivity, and health in a population. They help us to focus our efforts on issues and processes that will make the most difference for the well-being of everyone. We're going to talk about a large epidemiological study about the enduring effects of adverse childhood experience. And as mentioned, Dr. Rob Anda and Dr. Vincent Felitti are the co-principal investigators of the study, which they call the ACE study. During the latter part of the 20th century, we learned a great deal about risk factors for the major causes of disability, disease, and premature death. From hand washing to cancer screening, public health campaigns became more prominent. National education programs raised awareness about the many health risks due to cigarette smoking. A massive campaign was launched to teach the public about HIV transmission. And although campaigns are effective, they do not work well for everyone. Let's take the example of cigarettes. Despite knowledge of the health risks, many smokers never quit, while others attempt to quit but fail. Why are they unable to break this habit? And why do they start in the first place? During the late 1980s, Dr. Rob Anda, an internist and epidemiologist working in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, and his colleagues showed that those who were depressed were more likely to smoke. When smokers were followed up on for more than 10 years, those who were depressed were less likely to quit. Why? At that time, people were talking about self-medication as a way to understand behaviors like smoking, excessive drinking, and drug abuse. The concept is that the use of psychoactive drugs are more common in people who struggle with depression and anxiety. In the case of depression and its link to smoking, it became apparent that the nicotine in tobacco smoke was the likely explanation. Nicotine can reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety. So the benefits of nicotine in reducing these unpleasant emotions might help to explain why knowledge of health risks due to smoking are not enough for some people to quit. Shortly after publishing these studies, Dr. Anda and Dr. Vincent Felitti, director of the Department of Preventive Medicine at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, they visited each other to present their findings that related to childhood sexual abuse and to morbid obesity in women. Dr. Felitti believed that obesity was an understandable response to this form of childhood trauma because of the potential soothing effects of eating and because morbid obesity could be a defense against unwanted sexual advances. Something clicked between Dr. Anda and Dr. Felitti. Could it be that childhood adversity was a non-random generator of risk factors for major diseases and disability? They reviewed the literature on the effects of child abuse and realized it was time to broaden the scientific scope to include a broader public health perspective of the effects of childhood abuse and related adverse childhood experiences. Most prior studies of the health and social effects of childhood abuse focused on a single type of adversity, such as sexual abuse. The ACE study broadened the picture to include multiple types of childhood stressors. In addition, the study measured a wide array of health and social problems. This is how the ACE study expanded the knowledge into a broader public health perspective. So the ACE study is unique because it provides the potential to understand how multiple forms of childhood stressors can affect many important public health problems. Design of the ACE study began in 1991. In 1994, the CDC provided funding to conduct the ACE study at the Department of Preventive Medicine in San Diego. More than 17,000 adult members of the Kaiser Health Insurance Plan completed a survey about adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, as well as health behaviors, disease risks and disease, mental health and substance abuse, and other health and social problems. Their ages ranged from 19 to 94. Study participants were generally well educated. Most had attended college, and only 6% did not have a high school diploma, as compared with 13% of the US population. They were predominantly white, middle class, who had access to some of the best healthcare in the world. Study participants are still being followed to assess the relationship of ACEs to causes of death, incidence of diseases, healthcare utilization, and use of prescription medications. Now, I want you to think about this information, and Dr. Anda made a big point about this in our training. This is not the typical population that we all deal with in the work we do. Okay, I mean, it's we need to use a little insight maybe and extrapolate some of the information you learned today to the population that we work with and the impact that ACEs may have on them. So I'm planting that seed, and Dr. Anda did that as well, no doubt. So let's get into some nuts and bolts. You've heard a lot of information here. We're going to start to make some sense out of this. So this slide shows 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences that were studied. The first group are indicators of household dysfunction, which include growing up with substance abusing household members, alcohol or drugs, parental separation or divorce, growing up with mentally ill household members or caregivers, witnessing intimate partner violence, and for the study that was specifically having a battered mother, okay? And as well as criminal behavior as evidenced by having a household member imprisoned. 3 forms of childhood abuse were studied: emotional, physical, and sexual, and 2 forms of neglect were included: emotional and physical. Now, as you can see from the percentages on the slide, ACEs are common in this middle class, well-educated population. You can see the percentages. Total ACEs 10. So a little more information on this. Because adverse childhood experiences are so highly interrelated, it did not make sense to look at how single categories of ACEs influenced health and social problems. Instead, Doctors Anda and Fauquier developed an ACE score. This score is simply a count of the number of categories of ACEs that each person reported from 0 to 10. Each category counts as 1 point in the ACE score. So if a person experienced physical abuse, no matter how many times or what the severity of the abuse, the ACE score is 1. If the person experienced physical abuse and had a substance abusing parent, the ACE score is 2, and so forth. Think of the ACE score as a measure of childhood biologic stress dose. As the ACE score goes up, on average, the exposure to the developmental effects of toxic stress increases. In this illustration, you see that only a third of the people in the study had an ACE score of 0. And you can go along and look at the other scores of percentages there. Adverse childhood experiences are common. They tend to cluster, and ACEs are a hidden burden in this study population. So Kaitlyn, I'm going to turn it back to you to give some more information.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. I think it's always nice to have an overview of what the actual, initial study looked like so that we can take that information and apply it, right?
Yes.
So I gave you guys an anatomy lesson earlier. We're doing a statistics lesson now. Like I said, hope you have your coffee. But like Alan was talking about, people who report high ACE scores are more likely to have health and social problems. As the ACE score goes up, the percentage of people with health and social problems also goes up. This is what we call a dose-response relationship. So you guys can kind of see that here. I'm going to show you guys, I think like at least 4 or 5 of these graphs. They all look fairly similar, and each one is going to be looking at the relationship between ACEs and a different health or social problem that we're talking about right there. So that's what I want you guys to keep in mind. As the ACE score goes up, the percentage of people with the health and social problem that we're talking about also tends to go up. So here we're looking at the relationship between ACEs, smoking, and lung disease. And so all the data from all the slides that I'm about to show you are formatted in the same way. So along the bottom, or the horizontal axis down here, are the ACE scores from 0 on the left to 4 or more on the right. It's nice that they're color coded here, so hopefully that helps. And the vertical axis, or the y-axis on the left, is the percent of people who have the disease or the condition or the issue that we're talking about in that slide. So this first set of bars, if you guys look at this slide right here, on the far left, we see that the percent of people who became regular cigarette smokers by age 12 goes up as ACEs go up, right? If you guys kind of remember what Alan was just talking about, we see a huge correlation between ACEs and nicotine use. So people with high ACE scores have an increased risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. Again, we see on the right. About 4% of people with an ACE score of 0 still developed COPD, because that's possible, while more than double that percent of people, or what we're looking at, about 9% here, with an ACE score of 4 or more developed COPD, right? So we know that smoking leads to lung-related diseases. So to summarize this slide right here and kind of give us a better relationship here and understanding of that relationship. ACEs lead to an early onset of smoking, again, what we considered about like age 12, that's pretty early, which is sustained throughout adulthood, which we see in the middle as current smoking, that's what we consider, and eventually leads to a high risk of smoking-related lung disease. So, right, early smoking initiation, leads to a current, usually, every day, or somebody who smokes often, and when somebody smokes often or every day, we lead to lung-related diseases. So again, just kind of touching on that, we want to, especially when we talk about prevention, we want to talk about why don't some of these statistics, or why don't the scare tactics, so to speak, work on everybody, right? We know that smoking leads to lung-related diseases. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But ACEs result oftentimes in depression and anxiety. That's the issue we're talking about here. And nicotine can actually temporarily reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety. So the benefits of nicotine for a lot of folks in reducing these unpleasant emotions helps to explain why, excuse me, why knowledge of the health and social problems and the risks due to smoking are just simply not enough for a lot of people to quit, right? So what we're talking about here is they're weighing the consequences here. Right now, temporarily having those difficult emotions reduced for some people outweighs the risks that are going to come along later on. And so we can see smoking as an example of one of those adaptive behaviors to deal with some of the consequences of ACEs. So this is actually, maybe, I don't know, I'm biased, I do this a lot, but this is one of my favorite slides. So I hope that you guys get a lot out of this slide because it's really interesting to me. But we can begin to anticipate why ACEs are related to certain behaviors and social conditions, right? So here we see the risk of developing alcoholism increases 6-fold from an ACE score of 0 to an ACE score of 6, right? So we're looking at that left side of our bar graph over here. And ACEs also affect relationships. So people with high ACE scores are actually more likely to marry a person with alcoholism. So think about it for a couple of minutes, right? I do want to spend a little bit of time on this slide. It indicates how ACEs tend to be transmitted from one generation to the next. So I want to walk you guys through a quick example here. Let's say I am born and I automatically have an ACE score of 1 because I have a father that uses alcohol and has an alcohol use disorder in the home, right? Totally outside of my control, but I'm born with an ACE score of 1 because I have a substance abusing parent in the home. When I grow up and throughout my development and childhood, if this parent is still in the home, that's what I see, right? This is the behaviors that I see. This is the interactions and the relationships that become normalized to my environment. I become adapted to respond to somebody who is using substances in the home. As I grow up, because I've adapted to those relationships and I've learned to respond to those relationships, my likelihood of marrying somebody who exhibits the same behaviors increases dramatically in that dose response relationship that you guys see over here on the right, right? So I marry that person. Let's say me and this person have a child. That child is automatically born with an ACE score of 1 because there's already a substance using parent in the home, right? So when we talk about ACEs are common, ACEs are interrelated, ACEs are also transmitted intergenerationally because these things get passed down, right? We saw that, you know, in my example, I have an ACE score of 1 because I'm born with a substance using parent in the home. Based on my development, I marry somebody who has a substance use disorder. We have a child together. We can see how these things get passed down, right? And that's just one example. We can use that same example with things like neglect, with things like mental health issues as well. So, but again, this is one that from all the information that I'm sharing with you guys today in this section, I really want you guys to take away that these things are not just affecting us, but are being passed down intergenerationally. And like I said, so we went through an example of substance use. Let's take an example real quick to look at the relationship between ACEs and depression. So sometimes people, again, look at me like I have 3 heads when I say this, but depression is actually the leading cause of disability in developed countries, right? So that means that it's affecting our ability to work, engage in satisfying relationships, things like that. So here we see that the risk of depression increases for both men and women in that same dose response relationship as the ACE score goes up, right? So going back to what we were talking about earlier, ACEs are held in the body, right? These lead to mental, physical, and behavioral problems in adulthood. Some of those problems are unintentionally handed down to the next generation, like in my previous example on our slide talking about the relationship between ACEs and alcoholism. Becoming an alcoholic, marrying an alcoholic, and suffering from depression are a part of the intergenerational transmission of adverse childhood experiences, right? So again, that same concept of maybe I grow up and either I have depression and I have a child and that child automatically has an ACE score of 1 because they have somebody, a parent in the home that struggles with mental health. Maybe I marry somebody like that and we have a child together, right? These things are passed down intergenerationally. And again, when I talk about what I want you guys to really take away from this, this is also one that is really important, especially in our community, because this is not something that our community is unfamiliar with. So what I want you guys to look at here on this slide is that really one of the strongest relationships seen in the ACE study is between ACEs and the risk of suicide attempts. So people with an ACE score of 4 or more, as we can see here, have almost 20 times the risk of suicide attempts than people with an ACE score of 0. So I know I said that slowly, and it's because I really would like to emphasize it. We see a dramatic increase here if you guys look at this slide. So we're looking at folks with an ACE score of 0, right? We're looking at maybe, 1%-ish, if I can go off this graph, of they will still, have a risk of suicide attempts, right? Because again, these things still happen. We see not just this dose response, but almost an exponential growth here of folks with an ACE score of 4 or more having almost 20% of those folks attempting suicide at one point in their life, right? And so we're talking about things that we can't come back from, right? Suicide is not something that we can come back from if completed. And so that's why prevention of these things is so important. Prevention of the ACEs is really what we need to get at, right? So that we can help the folks, identify the folks that have high ACE scores, and put supports and programming in place so that they don't have to reach this point. And so the next couple of slides I'm going to show you guys, we're talking about things that we can contribute to ACEs, right? So here's a list of some of the health and social problems documented by the ACE study publications. We already talked about some of these, like alcoholism, alcohol abuse, mental health problems, smoking, depression, right? These are things that we can attribute to ACEs having a hand in that. And so because ACEs have a powerful impact on many health and social problems, the ACE researchers concluded that ACEs are the leading cause of health and social problems in our nation. And this should really, again, have us thinking about prevention, right? So if we look at this list, most of these things are preventable if we catch them at the right time, right? Which means we need to have the education, we need to have the knowledge to be able to identify these things. So as we've been saying, and it sounds like I'm kind of like a broken record at this point, right? But ACEs are common, ACEs are interrelated, and ACEs are powerful and have a cumulative impact that is captured by the ACE score that Alan was talking about when he was describing how the study was done. People with higher ACE scores are more likely to have multiple health and social problems, some of which increase their odds of their children having high ACE scores, as I showed you guys in that example that I gave earlier. The discoveries about the effects of toxic stress on the developing brain provide biologic plausibility for the ACE study findings. So what does that mean? That means we're looking at a very strong case for concluding that the relationship between ACEs and health and social problems is a cause and effect relationship, not a correlation, right? So we can start to identify some of these numbers that we're seeing in a public health study are not common numbers that we see in a lot of public health studies. That means there's strong evidence for ACEs causing these outcomes later on in life. And so again, this is what I kind of like to call like the oil slick graphic, so to speak. That's kind of what it looks like to me a little bit. So how do we put all this together, right, and make a case for understanding ACEs as a powerful pathway to health and well-being? So we understand that ACEs are common. They have a strong cumulative impact on the risk of common health and social problems, and preventing ACEs and their intergenerational transmission is the greatest opportunity that we have as a community and as providers for improving the well-being of human populations. So what we're talking about when I say the oil slick here is the percentage of various health and social problems that epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs. So, for example, it's estimated that 24% of cancers, if you look at the slide, could have been prevented had we prevented that person's adverse childhood experiences. Again, these are very, very high numbers. These are not numbers that we typically see in public health studies. So I like to point out that, again, taking a look at alcoholism, 65% of cases of alcohol use disorder is estimated that those cases could have been prevented by preventing that person's adverse childhood experiences, right? So when we look at some of these things, again, going back to the smoking example, we see that some of these things are used as coping mechanisms for difficult emotions. We talked about nicotine, temporarily relieving the symptoms of depression and anxiety. When we talk about alcoholism, right? If it didn't work temporarily, people wouldn't use the substance, right? That's the problem. And so we're talking about 51% of cases of a high risk for HIV could have been prevented by preventing ACEs. So all of these things, the ones that I tend to highlight the most are those huge numbers that we see. And again, same concept, but a couple different examples. I want to direct your guys' attention to kind of the bottom right piece of this slide right here. It's estimated that 67% cases of suicide could have been prevented by preventing adverse childhood experiences. That is a huge number, right? It is a huge number. And so again, a case for cause and effect relationship, not just a correlation, we notice these things. No, this is a case for a cause and effect. So the ACE study provides us with straightforward information, right, about the consequences of toxic stress during childhood. That's what we've been talking about, right? All of these things, especially in the kind of the statistics section that I just gave you guys, we're seeing the effects of ACEs that we carry into adulthood. This scientific research gives us powerful information we can use every day to improve our health, our prosperity, our safety, our longevity. But unfortunately, what the ACE study doesn't give us is a detailed roadmap of programs for the community, right? It doesn't tell us how to address some of these things. It tells us, here's the effects. Now, as a community, it's time for you guys to figure out how to address the effects, right? But it is an invitation for us to be pioneers, so to speak. So it's simply too important to wait for somebody else to design a roadmap. We're the ones living in our community, right? We are the ones working in our community and seeing people and working with our peers, right? It's our job. It's we're changing the language. You know, I'm not waiting for something to happen. I'm going to make something happen. I'm going to make a difference. So through our collective action, right, we are the ones that have the power to shift dynamics within our own families and within our own communities and even within larger society. I know sometimes we feel kind of small, but right, if we can kind of come together and be organized and plan, we really can make a difference in preventing some of these ACEs that lead to difficult outcomes in adulthood. So the last thing I'm going to talk to you guys about here before I turn it over to Alan is core protective systems, right? So I tried to make sure that we were taking a strengths-based approach to this entire presentation and focusing on resilience a little bit as we talk about some of these negative concepts and negative outcomes. So when people hear about the ACE study findings, they often ask about resilience, or at least we hope that they do, right? So our supportive actions really do matter. Our desire for resilience leads to naturally search for a way to help families and communities, right? So we get this information and hopefully a lot of people on this call are saying, okay, what do I do with this information to make a difference? And there's 3 protective systems that interact and guide positive adaptation. These are our individual capabilities, right? How do I bounce back by myself? What are my protective factors? Our attachment and belonging with caring and competent people, and protective community, faith, and cultural processes that happen on more of that higher level. And we know that the 3 protective systems are nested, right? People do well when they're living and thriving, families and communities. These things are interrelated. They're a nice little web together. If we can play with all 3 of these things together, we have a really good chance of establishing resilience and honing good coping skills, healthy coping skills. So again, that first one, we're going to kind of skip over a little bit because it's your individual capabilities, right? So everyone's a little bit different. Everybody's healthy coping skills look a little bit different, right? For one person, it might be I take care of myself by exercising and journaling. Maybe we meditate, maybe we listen to music, right? So everyone's a little bit different. The second one I'm going to focus on in this slide right here is our attachment and belonging, the relationships with other people, right? So relationships with caring and competent people are vital contributors to resilience and recovery, right? It's our healthy supports. Who in our lives are healthy connections for us, healthy supports that help to promote our positive growth. So people who have difficulty with emotional regulation, picking up social cues, problems with addiction and family bonds, and have other consequences of developmental trauma, these can be challenging friends and neighbors, right? We looked at some of the consequences that come from ACEs. But relationships that provide security and belonging will become the norm as we learn to improve our skills and competencies to be relevant and helpful during times of stress and challenge, as well as during celebration and rest, right? So folks, some of our most vulnerable folks, some of our folks with those really high ACE scores, those are our folks that really need to be at the center of our programming, right? Those are our folks that really need to be felt like they belong and they have legitimate healthy supports, right? They need to find a community and we need to make sure that our community is welcoming so that they feel comfortable reaching out for those supports. And lastly, taking a look at that third kind of core protective factor. So fostering thriving communities is all about empowerment, right? That's kind of the message I was trying to convey in here today is we're taking a strengths-based approach here. It's about investing in the people who have the most at stake, right? Our most vulnerable of the population, perhaps, so that they can be expert leaders of their own community's change. We want people to take an active role in their own community. So as we invest in community capacity, we can systematically provide education about neurobiology, like I gave you guys today, ACEs and resilience, so local people have a common language for cross-sector and multidisciplinary work, right? So we're all coming from different backgrounds. It's important for us to do presentations like this so that we have a common language to address the issues that we're talking about. So building community capacity is about helping people learn, manage, and improve their efforts systematically across the board, and about providing flexible funding, state-of-the-art education, and direct supports that help mobilize everybody who wants to help and make a difference. Public and private partners that foster thriving communities learn from those communities and celebrate exceptional results from their work, right? And as everybody on this call knows, we are all here for different reasons, but ideally we're probably all here so that we can learn and make a positive difference, whether that's in our own families, with our clients, in the community. We all know that success does not happen overnight, right? Just because we put on this presentation does not mean that ACEs are going to be prevented and no one's going to struggle. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a journey, both individually and community-based, that intentionally builds new capacities, skills, and supports for healing for folks that already have experienced the ACEs, and for prevention for our children as they continue to develop. So with that, I think that is the end of hearing me talk for this presentation. I believe I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Alan to continue talking about developing community capacity. And at the end, if anybody has questions, we'd be thrilled to answer them.
Well, we don't like thinking that we're not going to hear from you again. I think we might, because we'll have a little discussion, because it's a pleasure listening to you, Kaitlyn. Thank you for the delivery once again. So, let me skip here forward a second and continue the presentation. Kaitlyn was talking about each community working to address ACEs, and there's no real roadmap. So I'm going to, each successful community has traveled this journey differently, because each community is unique. We know we're not the same as we do have some similarities, but we all are unique. But communities that have reduced major social problems, reduced the percent of young people with high ACE scores, and improved key factors for resilience do use similar processes for achieving better results. They use these processes to work over time to build new capacities for helping one another to thrive, and new capacities for aligning resources and systems so they achieve better results. An example of one system is in Washington State. There is a system in Washington State of community public health and safety networks. And they call in Washington State, a system of community public health and safety networks calls these communities high capacity communities. The process they have used since 1994 is called general community capacity development. It's a public health approach to solving interrelated problems by improving people's connections, their shared responsibility, and their collective impact of their efforts. Community capacity development puts into place a 4-phased process to nurture development of healthy and productive adults, regardless of the circumstances into which they are born. It is an approach that invites all members of the community to shift the ways we engage with one another on a day-to-day basis, improving people's connections, shared responsibility, skills, and efficacy. This approach increases the collective impact of services and neighborhood initiatives by aligning efforts around common purpose. The 4 phases in the process are leadership expansion, coming together around issues of importance of the community, learning together, and results-based decision making. The process is powerful because success in one phase propels success in the next phase. It generates a virtuous cycle with the power to improve population, health, and uses all of the resources in the community, including its people power. Now, supporting healthy community processes that respect cultural traditions and values is a high leverage activity. Just as a rising tide lifts all boats, a high capacity community lifts all beings. People living in high capacity communities are less likely to have adverse childhood experience scores, less drug and alcohol abuse, less depression and serious and persistent mental illness, and fewer problems in school and at work. I love this slide here. The change is up to us. There's a predictable pattern in transformative change. It begins with discovery and communication, which leads people to clarify their values and thinking. With new knowledge and new habits of thinking, people change the actions they take in everyday life. The collective actions of many people shape a new reality that is ratified in organizational and policy change. You know, the truth of it is this: people create a new reality long before new laws are passed. So the change is up to us. It is shaped by our thoughts, our conversations, the way we relate with one another in relationships, in families, and in communities. You know, I always like to make a couple of comments here at the end, you know, that relate to ACEs. One key point is ACEs, you know, when you look at this adverse childhood experiences, they're not destiny. They're not destiny. You know, we can help people who have experienced ACEs. We can help get them to what they need to move past that trauma and those experiences. And and again, that boils down to us working together, having appropriate programs, and continuing to make this a key issue that we want to address. So as we work to prevent the accumulation of ACEs, let's keep in mind that we don't have to get to ACE scores of 0. Bringing scores down any amount will have huge effects. We might not be able to prevent the first ACE from occurring in a family, but we can certainly notice when children have 5 ACEs and make sure that that number does not go to 10. As we thread through all of our work, a new focus of supporting adults, particularly adults who, through no fault of their own, experienced many ACEs when they were children, we will prevent ACEs for the next generation. And that was a key point that Dr. Anda made in our presentation. You know, what's the first step forward with this? And that's it. Identify adults who have high ACE scores and begin to help them, like the statement just said, move through that experience. And then that will help prevent the generational transmission of these ACEs into the future. And definitely recognizing children who have ACE scores and getting involved early and often through prevention and interventions that are needed. You know, we live at a time of great hope and promise. The largest public health discovery of our time, and perhaps of all time, is about family, community, and children. It's about us. Our action to prevent ACEs, whether large or small, can profoundly improve our future. Now, you know, I do want to make a couple more comments as we slide forward, and then we'll have a discussion. We'll hear from Renee and have some discussion. But a couple of points here. You know, when you look at this ACE score, keep in mind the ACE score is a history tool, you know, and it tells you some things that have gone on in someone's past. It opens up doors for some communication and exploration and potential help. So it's a communication tool to comfortably talk about life experiences. It's about part of, it's becoming part of a common language and a gateway to empathy, compassion, and healing. You know, what it is not is this: it is not a diagnostic tool. You know, I've heard people say, hey, I'm going to take this stuff and use it to diagnose people. That's not what this is made for. It's not for that. It's not a screening tool. It is not a predictor at the individual level or just a fun quiz. It is really a communication tool, a way to open up. Now, I don't mind saying, I got to throw this in. I spent 28 years doing probation and parole work in the past. And I'm going to tell you, I worked with a lot of people who had ACE scores. We didn't know what ACEs was back then, you know, but we do now. But, you know, I just kept, I always knew something was needed to be helped here because of the past. So me, I always asked, you know, things like, you know, what happened to you? What have you experienced? You know, I wanted them to open up and tell me their stories. So, because I knew all of this had affected them. I did a lot of background reports on individuals, so I knew all about their childhood and this, that. So you could see early that this affected them. And you know what? In the probation parole system, it resulted in convictions, prison time, and things like that. So, and substance abuse, mental health issues, it was all in there. It was all in there. So, you know, this is great because we have an opportunity to work together and make a difference. Now, I want to thank everyone for being here today on behalf of myself and Kaitlyn. You know, we don't do this alone. The more people train, the more we can work together and do it as part of a system. So thank you, Renee. Thank you, Bridget, for having us here today. I'm going to be quiet and turn this over to Renee. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan and Kaitlyn. I think it's great that we have this information. I was glad when Alan, you know, shared those last comments. I remember the first time I took the ACEs class, I sort of left with the, well, now what? And so, you know, thinking back on it, really understanding that these are ACEs, yes, but it isn't for us to, you know, as Alan said, take out our little piece of paper and look at people and go, oh, they have this, they have this, they have this. Therefore, they have a score of such and such. That isn't this at all. First of all, we have these adverse childhood experiences. It's good to know a little bit about trauma because people can experience the same trauma, but not have the same effect from that, right? So you can have two people that are involved in an automobile accident, and one might go on to develop, you know, some sort of anxiety about riding in cars, and the other wasn't a big deal. So we don't know exactly why some people have better experiences after trauma than others. I'm sure there's more research being done in that. But I think looking at ACEs and first of all, sort of turning the lens on ourselves first. You know, Alan said it was great to be able, and Kaitlyn also talked about identifying, you know. So, you know, if I was a child who had a parent who experienced, trouble with substance use, you know, it's good to acknowledge that and to talk about it. The thing I love about this current generation is that they talk about everything. And so, you know, just naming it. And it might be that you are one of those, you know, had more resilient factors, so it didn't impact the next generation. But understanding that by talking about it, by speaking with your siblings or your children, bringing that out into the open makes it less likely for it to impact, but also then if there is an issue, getting those people help. You know, so turning the lens at ourselves, talking about it, looking at our coping mechanisms. You know, Kaitlyn talked about alcoholism being a coping mechanism. It is, right? We're trying to numb ourselves. So thinking about, you know, when I feel stressed, what do I do? Is that healthy? You know, really, you know, if you think about when you're on an airplane and the flight attendant says, you know, when the oxygen masks fall from the ceiling, what are you supposed to do first? You're supposed to put your mask on first before helping anyone else, right? So if all of us can turn that lens to ourselves and really start healing ourselves, whether that's small healing or a larger healing, maybe you can do it with just supportive people around you, or maybe it would be good to go see a professional, a mental health counselor, a peer support specialist, somebody to help you navigate creating better coping mechanisms for you. And then sharing your journey with those around you so that maybe if they are also facing similar circumstances, they can have that power. And then as we turn the lens to our families, to our support networks, to our communities, it makes us stronger to have that impact. But I'd love to hear you all's questions or comments or your reflections on, this talk. So does anyone want to share or have any questions?